Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, the host of the Angelo Robles podcast. I'm also the founder and CEO at FamilyOffice Association. To provide a little context to my conversations and discussions, I help global families and their family offices solve problems, procure positive future outcomes, and prepare for intergenerational necessity. It's vital for families and their family offices to understand their vulnerabilities and become more resilient so they can mitigate risk and prevail in times of crisis. My experience with some of the wealthiest families in the world has allowed me to distill their best practices for discovering purpose, refining vision, governance structures, systems, processes, and culture that successful families and their safeguard family offices need in order to thrive. I help families create or reinvent their family office to be of institutional quality and highly adaptive. There was one word in my opener, well, technically it's two words: solve problems. That's an incredibly great critical thinking skill, but it's more than just critical thinking. And I'm really happy to say the guest we have on today would probably signify that verbiage, solve problems, in an incredibly creative and very interesting way. We're titling it Biggest Trends in Cities and How Technology Will Reshape Our Lives. If I could give it a subtitle, 2020 State of Affairs, I may argue, are we doomed? But I think Alex has perhaps a little bit more of a positive spin on it. There's many different titles I could have gave today's discussions because we're going to cover even more than what I'm noting. It's going to cover a lot of ground in relatively an hour that's going to fly by. Our special guest today is Alex Lightman, founder of the Lightman Report. I met Alex through a mutual introduction about 4 years ago at the Westchester Country Club, where I hosted some of my New York City area events and found him to be completely fascinating. I had a chance to sit near him during dinner and he kept me very, very occupied, just kind of picking his brain about all these unique things and solving problems. He solved some problems I had. So let's see if he could do it today. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Angelo. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm sure that your program and the people who listen to it have an extraordinary impact on the world. And there are problems that need to be solved, some of them with money and thought and care and with a long-term vision. And I hope that we'll have time to go over that today.
I think we will. And why don't we get right into it? So we're about 6 or 7 months in now, at least here in the United States, into COVID. Probably the vast majority of us, outside of you, but the vast majority underestimated it heading into the early stages when we heard about it late December into January. And here in the New York City area, when our shutdown started to occur kind of early to mid-March, it has impacted unemployment like nothing has in multiple decades. It's been incredibly devastating to people from a business, supporting families, and a social perspective. It has really been devastating. And to hear the CDC, which I have some issues there, but unfortunately, I think their next comment is correct. You just do the math, and that it may not be normal or a new normal, meaning 70% of the population hopefully having a vaccine until probably about third quarter of next year. So this is going to be with us on some level for a long time, longer than it's been with us already, which is 6 to 7 months. What do you think how has the crisis impacted us? And it's always hindsight looking back. So maybe let's not do that. But looking forward, how could we learn and adapt to this?
The COVID-19 crisis accelerated things that were already happening in both a positive and a negative and a neutral sense. Because, of course, whether you see something positive or negative is whether it helps you or hurts you. We're living in science fictional times. Many things, if not all the things that are happening now, have been written up for decades by science fiction writers. And one normal way that people go about writing science fiction is to pick one technological change and then say who is helped by it the most and who is hurt by it the most, and then use those as viewpoint characters. So one of the people who have been helped the most by COVID are those who do online retailing, e-commerce and m-commerce, mobile commerce. And we had only about 16% last year of our retail sales were e-commerce. And it was going to be more than a decade before e-commerce was more than physical retail, brick and mortar retail. And that will happen this year. So we basically have plunged in certain areas into the future by a decade or two. William Gibson, the author of the first major famous cyberpunk novel, Neuromancer, said, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So some people have done very well. Jeff Bezos and his ex-wife, Mackenzie Scott, now the richest woman in the world, richest man in the world, richest woman in the world, not married. That's quite an extraordinary thing. And 1,000 years from now, people will be talking about that. Another thing is that it just shows that government is not the solution. Government's not the answer. And so there are some people who are like a mouse that finds cheese in a maze once, and then the scientists take it away and it just goes back to the same place over and over. Government isn't the solution. I don't know that government had, by intervening, by having hundreds of hours of press conferences, has made things better, because there's a misunderstanding of the root cause of this. The root cause of this is that China is bound and determined to want to be the biggest and most important economy of the world. And there's two ways to do that. One is to do it fairly by being better at selling products and services people want. And the other way is just simply to whittle away at the advantages of other people. So it's my belief, it doesn't have to be shared by anybody else, that this is not a natural thing. This didn't just suddenly emerge from a marketplace to infect the world the way that it has. If you read the papers of Zheng Lishi, she says in 2008 that the coronavirus, that SARS CoV, could not infect through the lungs, but that by basically altering very specific things, that she was able to attach it to the ACE2 receptor. So these papers are widely available. She basically bioengineered it so that it would go and infect through the lungs. So there is a smoking gun. Nobody wants to see it because nobody really wants to take on China. China just seems like too big an opponent. And China has said, if you say these things, then, well, we're going to be mad at you and we're going to do things to you. But this is a country that has killed 100 million people. What's a couple of million more? It just doesn't matter in that mindset. And I posted this on Facebook recently, and a Chinese person said, well, when you wash your hands, you kill millions of bacteria, so you're also guilty of genocide too. So actually that mentality of defending killing 100 million people means that you basically try to equivocate. There's no way to equivocate it. So this is, to me, a very big challenge, and everything that will happen for the next few decades will revolve around how the world responds to the Chinese challenge. Now, with the ideas that we're talking about cities, so I guess I could start by saying, I think that there's 5 areas that we fit these changes, these technology trends in cities. And the first 3 are something I wrote a chapter in the book, Augmented, Life in the Smart Lane, which I wrote with Brett King. Brett King was the primary author of it. I have 3 chapters in the book. And it's a chapter on smart, green, augmented cities. So smart cities are those that take data and create feedback loops. So they're recording the number of cars that go into a garage and showing you on a display how many parking spots there are. They're recording the temperature and they're advising people to be inside. So in many places in Japan and in other places in the world, you have people going underground more in the winter and in the summer. If it's too hot, too cold, they go underground. And green means that they aren't burning fossil fuels and they have a lot of plants and trees. It's well known that if you have trees outside of a retail establishment, they have more sales. If you have trees outside of a home, the price of that home goes up, and so on. And augmented means that you're basically making it so that people can see more than the city. The city becomes transparent to people who have augmented reality, or virtual reality or AI or drones, those kind of things. And that relates to all three of these things have some overlap. The other two things besides smart, green, augmented are cities that increase your life expectancy and cities that increase your IQ. So if we ask about what we should be focused on, because a lot of people wonder, what should I be focused on? I think in general, you should think, how can I add 20 years to my life? And how can I add 20 points to my IQ? Since the people who are watching the show have higher than normal wealth, I think it's very important just to say, what's the highest ROI that you can do personally? And that is increase your life by 20 years and increase your IQ by 20 points. These are both very possible. And you had Peter Diamandis as a guest on your show. I recently went to his Platinum Abundance event, which was quite wonderful. And I talked about these linear decay factors. So our whole healthcare system is set up to go treat illness and injuries. But there's a third category that we don't think much about, but which is withering, those things that wither over time. And they all start at a certain specific year of our lives, and they get 1% to 3% worse every year, year after year. And so all of them can be arrested. All of them can be made so that they don't get worse. But the one that many people know who are older, and I'm guessing your audience skews older, is sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is muscle poverty. That's what it means, but muscle wasting. We lose about 1% of our muscle mass each year from the age of 30. Women, I made my own nomenclature for this because we're not really thinking about it enough to see these as a whole category. So I've taken the sarcopenia way and I've applied it to many other things. But the second one is osteopenia. There's a different word meaning of that, but I'm using it in the sense of losing bone mass. So women lose 2.5% of their bone mass from the age of 40 in their spine and in their hips. Michelle Obama hosted a woman while she was in office who was 107 years old, and she came up about to Michelle Obama's waist. And I looked, and that woman used to be as tall as Michelle Obama, but because she lost so much bone mass and muscle mass, she shrunk. So she was about half her size by making it to that age. If you made it to age 120 and you didn't keep your muscle and you didn't keep your bone, you would be a small fraction of the size that you are now because you would be losing that. And we also lose about 0.4 of our VO2 max, the ability to process oxygen, which is probably the strongest correlation with life expectancy and intelligence of any other single measure by my research. The average person might have a VO2 max around 30 to 35 or so. It is possible to get it to 40 or 50. And if you do, you'll add 20 years to your life on average. Then we have the what I call neuropenia. We lose brain mass each year. So ultimately, if we don't create new brain cells and we don't learn new things, then our brain hardware, the nerve cells, it's as if we're taking a cube of sugar worth of brain and we're basically just scooping it out, like with a little tiny ice cream scoop every year. And so ultimately, as we tie all these things back to cities, I think cities need to make people live longer. If you look at Japanese are living to about 82 or so, and most of them live in cities. I think it's about 80% of people live in cities. My zip code in Santa Monica, the average person lives to 82. It's much longer than, let's say, zip codes in Mississippi and Alabama and other places where they eat a lot of sugar and deep fried foods. So we want to have cities I guess you could look at two different kinds of cities. One city I would call a dog-eat-dog city, where your purpose is to go there and compete, what we call the rat race, and you're competing with everybody, you're trying to just make money. The other thing that I would compare that with is a bird of a feather city or a community of practice city, where people are gathered there for a certain purpose. So my girlfriend lives in San Diego around La Jolla. La Jolla is filled with people who are working on biotechnology and on life extension. They want to help people live longer, and that's kind of their common purpose. And if you want to be around people for cookouts and restaurants and meetings where you're all thinking about how do we make multi-billion-dollar companies around helping humans live longer, that's probably the best place to live, living in La Jolla near University of California at San Diego. So ultimately, the advantage of cities comes down to three things: serendipity, and synchronicity and synergy. So serendipity is you just go out and you meet somebody. On the times when I come to New York, I used to live in New York. I used to work for Reuters at 1700 Broadway, and I lived in Greenwich Village, and then I lived out in Stamford, Connecticut. And I would just, every time I would walk the streets of Manhattan, I would run into someone that I knew. It's kind of incredible. It's the only place in the world where that's true. I can go for months in Santa Monica and walk the streets, and I walk about 2 hours a day outside and never run into somebody that I know, ever. And I've been here for decades. So there's that running into somebody. And in Silicon Valley, one of the things that makes it such a great place is that you are out and you run into people, especially if you go to Bucks and Woodside. That's where all the venture capitalists hang out. You can run into people and say, hey, I heard you have a good company. Why don't you swing by and make a presentation or so? That can't be duplicated by Zoom. So you can move out of New York or other cities in order to save taxes or have cleaner air or whatever, but you're not going to have that same spontaneity. And the second thing is the synchronicity, that you can have a project and go, okay, who can I get on my team to help me do this? And boom, you can have all kinds of people meet with you for lunch and get that project underway. And then the third thing is synergy. You have so many people who are related to your area. So Michael Porter had this book called Competitive Strategy, Competitive Advantage. And then he had one called The Competitive Advantage of Nations. And he showed how nations could be the best in something. Even little nations like Singapore or Korea would be the best in the world in certain things. And it's because in the cities, they have regional clusters of headquarters, so that if one person gets fired or leaves, that person could just walk out the door of one building and in the door of a company that's very similar to it. So there are areas where they make skis and ski bindings, and areas where, like in New York, you make money and you make loans and you have equity and debt and all these kind of commercial kind of things. And it's not really equaled for Americans anywhere else in America. And so ultimately, the advantages of cities are absolutely enormous. And yes, you pay more in taxes. However, you're paying taxes on money that you make, and you're making more money. So a lot of New Yorkers would move to, say, Florida, where they don't have a state income tax, but that saves you, okay, that saves you a certain amount. But what if you can make 2 to 3 times as much money? It's worth paying the extra taxes. So I'm not so down on cities. I also think, and this is kind of just getting right to the chase, that cities have an option. States have an option, and even countries have an option for their financing. And that is to switch from being debt financed to being equity financed. I think that that cities could say, okay, you don't have to pay this tax, but if you create a new company, you need to give the city 5% of the equity. That cities can have big, giant portfolios of equities. And if you say, well, that could never work, there's an example of this today, which is in China. So some of the largest funds in the world that are not counted, the secret funds in the world, are those that are Chinese government funds, which own shares, the government's portion of shares of all these companies. So all the mobile carriers, all the airlines, the banks, a lot of these companies, the government owns very large pieces of them, but they have small pieces of them that are out there because that allows them to be marked to market and people to look at that. So that's a very interesting feedback mechanism. Now, you may wonder, well, what about US law? In fact, any federal agency, and last time I looked, there were 208 federal agencies, can make any equity investment it wants without changing the law. So for instance, Lee Iacocca got money for Chrysler. That's very well known. And then also during the Obama administration, there were big investments in Ford and GM. And I call this whole thing equitocracy. I think that governments should be able to own shares in companies, but vice versa, individuals and family offices and funds and companies should be able to own shares in governments. I don't personally think it's fair that a billionaire gets one vote and a person who doesn't care, is illiterate, doesn't care very much, can have the same. And I have a friend in Florida who claims he's documenting that he's received 30 ballots to vote. So he has the ability to vote 30 times. It's so easy to do that. I think that the standard for counting votes for public companies is higher than the standard for voting in most of the countries of the world. I've been talking for a while, so please I'll turn it back for a conversation.
Yeah, wow, you covered so much. Ironic that we began with China and ended, and probably people didn't see that little twist at the end coming. I wish I had more time to dive deeper into your opinion on the COVID in China. I for sure think it's possible, but I can't say that I've done enough of my diligence or research on my side. But arguably, the ease of creating bio warfare for all the bad guys and gals out there is going to get easier and easier. I don't know if there's going to be a way to counteract that other than very, very smart people inventing, I don't know what the word is, antibodies, where it's not going to take 18 months. It's going to take like a day or two. And I don't think we're there from a technological perspective yet. I don't really know if that's more of a question for you, Alex, because I probably don't want to go super deep down that rabbit hole because we have so much more to discuss.
There's a Netflix show that that answers your question called Biohackers. It's dubbed from the German, but basically the plot revolves around science fiction of one change. And the change is that there's a world-class woman named Lawrence who has developed the way to engineer humans so that they can have supreme immune systems, so that they basically can repel anything. That is something that the government is going to have to put money into. That is the answer. The way that Dave Asprey calls it is heal like Wolverine, because Wolverine is one of the characters in the Marvel universe.
He's a colorful character, Osprey. And yes, I think my audience knows Marvel and Wolverine. Correct.
Well, but I mean, the idea is that we can accelerate our healing. So I'm famous among my friends when we lift weights together. I have the ability to recover really rapidly from exercise, and I have very dense bones. And these are things that are documentable and provable, and they're not by accident, they're on purpose. So as we're talking about COVID, one of the things it's doing is it's separating out those who can read and pay attention and think for themselves, and actually read PubMed and science reports. So if you're not taking vitamin D shots, you're an idiot. Vitamin D is one of the sine qua nons of being able to be more resistant. You need to be taking zinc. You should be taking, basically there's a melatonin. There are a number of things that you can do to make your body less of a fertile garden for the SARS-CoV-2 to be able to flourish inside your body. I think there are lots of people who might have gotten it and just simply didn't have any ill effects because they got their supplements right. So I go and I get NAD supplements and I get vitamin D shots on a regular basis and vitamin cocktails. And I've been seeing a lot of people. I haven't had a problem. And the people who have followed my advice on this have also not had problems. And I've been giving this advice since January because all the things that are happening now, you didn't need the CDC, which by the way is not a government agency, it's a public-private partnership. So the idea that the CDC says that landlords can't evict people, it's nonsense. They have no power to do that. And so what we see is these overstep of even what amount to profit-making corporations pretending to be the government. It's absurd and obnoxious.
When you mentioned before relative to perhaps the government making investments, it reminded me I had on, and I know he's highly controversial, but a couple of months ago, Peter Schiff, and we were talking about the airlines. They're going to be devastating. And basically he's like, they're not going to magically take the planes and have them disappear. It's the companies that manage them that will likely disappear. But that creates an opportunity to buy it out of bankruptcy. And that was his argument for not bailing out every industry. Again, a very debatable subject. But when you mentioned what you title as equitocracy,
equitocracy.
That reminded me a little bit. Could I make the argument of how you described it, and when you brought in China as the example, is that somewhat communistic?
Well, the whole thing is that some things are on a circle rather than a line. And if you go down enough in one direction, you end up in another. And so, you have such large firms that own such big portfolios that they have to think like governments. It's just what it all decomposes to is math and game theory. And part of the reason that crypto, you'd mentioned before we talked that you wanted to talk about crypto, the Lightman report is mostly, but not entirely, about crypto, is that crypto, there are two big problems for human beings who living in the moment. Either, and you talked about solving problems. So problems can be like Goldilocks. Remember Goldilocks going in, the bed is too hard, the bed is too soft, the bed is just right. The thing about problems is they're either too easy and we get bored, and boredom can lead to people drinking and doing drugs and even suicide, or problems can be too hard, or they can be just right. And so one of the challenges for governments and the challenges for corporations for their employees is to make problems queued up such that they're not too hard to solve and not too easy to solve, so people don't get frustrated or bored, but they're just right for that level. So we have to be much better at doing assessments of people's cognitive capacity, their sanity, their energy level, and we can start to measure all these things, how well your mitochondria do and so on. But ultimately, cryptocurrency and crypto commodities and crypto derivatives are going to win simply because they are closer to the reality of what we live, which is math plus game theory. You can adjust the complexity using crypto techniques and algorithms to make problems just big enough to solve, because some things are just too complex. And if things are too complex, it's very hard to get consensus between, say, Republicans and Democrats in Congress to have a kind of a resolution on something. So ultimately, we still haven't decided as a group to be unified about whether global warming is real or not, whether weather modification is real or not, whether aliens are real or not. In other words, we could make a list of about 1,000 things that we haven't decided are real or not. And if you don't have the same underlying philosophy and the same values and the same goals and the ability to say, yeah, this is a reasonable way of assessing if someone's capable of doing this job or not, and this is reasonable compensation, then we're going to be spending too much of our time arguing. Tom Peters liked to say that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And what we don't have is we don't have a common human culture where we can pick those problems to solve. So I would just say, if I were in charge of a country or the world, I would say, okay, we need to work on life extension and intelligence increase, that we need to make people smarter, because ultimately there is no better return on investment than those things. And so I don't see a single politician in the world doing that. There are hundreds of thousands of elected officials. There are people, just 73,000 school boards alone in the US. I don't know of a single school teaching kids how to live longer, and even junk food. So I ran a boarding school. I had a boarding school that I started and ran. It's a high school and a college in New Mexico. I had no junk food, didn't serve meat, didn't basically taught kids to have enough sensitivity, did fasting in the school, did meditation, did yoga. And what all that does is it recalibrates your senses so that if you eat something that's bad for you, you notice it. The problem with eating junk food all the time is you can eat something that makes you sick, but you're so numb to it, you don't even notice it. So bad food on top of bad food, and you have a stomachache all the time, but it becomes normalized, so you don't notice it. So ultimately, one of the problems, as we pull this back to the city, is that we have to have more knowledge from our community of practice of people who can help us than the opportunities given to advertisers. So part of the problem of living in Santa Monica or living in Manhattan is that there's so much junk food around. It's so readily available. Crappy food is available all the time, 24/7, 365, and it's so much easier than making it for yourself. And one other thing I wanted to say about cities is that the biggest problem that I can think of in the world is loneliness, particularly for wealthy people. So I read recently that 38% of American young people don't have a single friend. I can't imagine what a hellscape life would be if you're facing all of this bad news and you don't have a friend to talk about it with, and you don't have aren't able to process it. And I think that the percentage of people who have no friends is increasing. And we also see that the suicide rate for people in between 10 and 20, between 20 and 30, and 30 and 40, I think, is at all-time highs. So as we become more and more isolated, and we have less serendipity and chance for friends, as we have more and more time focusing on screens and Facebook and stuff, we have less time to make real friends. And if we don't have a friend, life is horrible.
Well, then, I mean, let's dig into that a little deeper. And I guess I'll take a little bit of the negative perspective. Pre-COVID, these San Francisco, LA, New York, Boston, et cetera, they were hotbeds of where young, talented people wanted to live in from a social aspect, graduating from college, and it's kind of where the jobs were. Also, there's a reason for that. Those four, especially, probably, all four, and there's others, they have great universities, and that played into it. But now during COVID, so much has changed. The culture is incredibly limited now. The travel to and fro getting better, but still not there. In New York, it's going to get flu season. It's going to get cold. The outdoor restaurants are going to disappear. I think 60 to 70% of those small businesses like restaurants, I just don't see them making it. How about the landlords that are over leveraged? How about the office space? How about remote work is kind of, I'm not saying it's perfect, but kind of working. And do I really need to be an analyst at a hedge fund in Greenwich or New York? Or in theory, could I do that role if I wanted to live in Colorado? So you have all these challenges with cities coupled with social unrest, with more lawlessness than ever before. Regulatory issues are getting worse. The city of New York is laying off people left and right. And you have, taxes are going to play into it. You have federal, you have state, you have New York City. If you're in New York City, you're in California, you know what it's like to get crushed. And I can't imagine that getting better. I mean, I know I'm painting a rather ugly picture. I want you to make me feel better. The serendipity part and bumping into people where if you're in a small town in Florida, yeah, if I'm 22, that may concern me, but if I'm married in my 30s, maybe I want some of that peace and that freedom and the greater flexibility. Am I really going to make more money by being in New York? I might. And 20 years ago, I would have said for sure. But with bandwidth now and Wi-Fi and our interconnectivity and how the Generation Z is used to communicating, and they're going to come into a position of power and voting it in companies. I hate to sound negative on the big cities, but I'm having a hard time being positive about it. Make me feel better.
Well, I hope that you release me, you forgive me if I don't necessarily just try to make you feel better, because I'm fact-based and I'm reality-based. So let's look at a couple things. First of all, when people talk about remote working, this is an experiment, and we should think of it as an experiment. We shouldn't try to say it's working or it's not working. We should try to have a thesis or a hypothesis, and then we should test it and see if it works. So for instance, what company do you know has a measure of its productivity before COVID, and then when everybody's working from home and can say it? Because all this money was just flooding the market because Donald Trump wants to be reelected, and he's been hammering the Federal Reserve like, oh, make the interest rates lower. You know, these are not the times when we can say what works or what not, because you can't keep throwing spending more money and increasing the deficit indefinitely. Remember when Bill Clinton, let's look at the 90s. Let's look at something that worked. So in the late 60s and early 70s, the US federal government spent $50 million on the IPv4, the Internet Protocol version 4 Internet. And in the 1990s, the Internet, it took a while to percolate and to World Wide Web to come around with the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana collage that became Mosaic, that became Internet Explorer, and all these other things. So once we had the web browser and we had the web, we had a commercial explosion, and we created 27 million jobs net during the 90s. And we had divided government, and we had Newt Gingrich in the contract with America shutting down the government to avoid spending. So we kept spending down, but revenues went way up because of capital gains. And the US was so far ahead of everybody. we had 625 publicly traded internet companies when Japan, the second biggest economy at the time, had just one publicly traded internet company, Rakuten. So, and at the end of that, we had surpluses. We had federal budget surpluses, and America would be stronger because just like a corporation that doesn't make a profit, that only makes losses, is not a real corporation. It's just pretending to be a corporation. And so now we have what, a $6 trillion deficit for this year. And you know that the statistics are fraudulent from all big governments. So you know that it's worse than that. And we would only see those statistics if we had a different party. And the same thing for the next party. We just decided that that's all okay. But ultimately, I can't make you feel better about higher taxes or anything, because I'm going to move from California. I'm probably, it's between Wyoming or Florida or Puerto Rico. I filed for.
So talk about taxes.
Yeah. Well, so because people who want to do big things in the world, want to make corporations, don't want to pay a disproportionate share of what they're doing. I mean, I don't know. That's my philosophy. So if my taxes were going in, but I got shares back in return, this is what equitocracy would give. Great. I'd want to live in high tax areas that were well run. I don't mind high tax areas, but I don't want a high tax area where they're raising the taxes because they're incompetent. Like, for instance, I'm here in Santa Monica. I was here walking the streets when they had the so-called protests, and then we had all of these people come and loot. 350 businesses were basically attacked. 9 were set on fire. I was here and I saw who did it. I saw what they did. I mean, mostly what they're doing is stealing sneakers that wouldn't fit anyway. I mean, you're not going to try them on while you're looting the store. And then you sell them on eBay for what? $50 or something. So you destroy a store, you cause hundreds of millions in damage so that a few people can make a few $100. It's idiotic. And what did the Santa Monica City Council do? They basically did nothing. I talked to business owners, including some who lost millions of dollars. The guy who had a shop with dinosaur bones and fossils and gemstones that lost millions of dollars. And he said on a scale of 1 to 100, the government response was a 0, and it's still a 0. And most of the town is still a ghost town. The tourists that were a big part of it are gone. So why should this city, after being utterly incompetent, be able to raise its taxes? So what you're going to want is you're going to want to have a community that is safe and secure. And you know what? In some cases, and this will be very controversial for many people who don't like guns, but and I don't have a gun. I'm not using a gun, but the Second Amendment says that people can. So I look at a community like Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where they basically, the armed citizens just set up and patrolled the streets. And they still had people coming and protests. I saw pictures of it, but they didn't have widespread looting because they were prepared to do it. So you're going to have communities that have people who are organized and able to responsibly arm and armor themselves and will to keep incursions from arsonists. That's the big thing for me. And the one thing that hasn't been reported about my city, but I know is true, is that there are about 30 people after looting the drugstore on 5th Street, went across to the Chevron station, and they were preparing to fill up bottles for Molotov cocktails to burn down the city. And the owner of the gas station came out with 2 guns and basically held off a mob of 30 people. And if not for that, it wouldn't have been only 9 buildings that burned. It might have been 500 buildings that burned. So ultimately, the city, I've had probably 5 different people who have connection to law enforcement and or intelligence agencies tell me not to be in Santa Monica or LA during the election and the day afterwards, because there are arson is planned. And we look at the Pacific Northwest. If you look at a map where all the fires are in the Western United States, and then you look at what the Canadian border is, the fires all stop at the Canadian borders. Why? Well, part of it is because there's a measure of, is the country going in the right direction or the wrong direction? And it's if you are supporting Joe Biden, you want those numbers to say that the country's going in the wrong direction. And all it takes is just to burn a city or set a forest on fire, and you've got a few thousand more people maybe even a few million people thinking it's going in the wrong direction. So ultimately, I think equitocracy is the solution to this, because we have perverse incentives. We have moral hazard that is now rewarding people, because the president has probably, well, if you look at this as a $4 trillion in federal revenue and $6 trillion deficit, $10 trillion. So the president can basically deploy about anywhere from 20 to $40 trillion, and he can deploy it among cronies. That's a very perverse incentive to burn down buildings, or to set forests on fire, or to drag people from their car and beat them, or to shoot them, and do all that in order to get that money. And ultimately, we have to redesign our system of incentives so that people who set fires do not have anything to gain from it. People who shoot people have nothing to gain for it. People who loot and riot have nothing to gain for it. Instead of thinking, oh, there's somebody who's damaged something, let's buy them off. Let's bribe them so we don't do that anymore. And ultimately, this is the biggest weakness of cities, is that they're too eager to propitiate all of the people and act in a victim mentality. It's like, please, if I just give you money, if I just give you this, please don't attack me anymore. And so this is why people are going to move to guarded enclaves filled with armed people who train together and drill together. You know, I could see something like the Netherlands. So the Netherlands is about 1/3 underwater. It's below sea level. And they had something that in Dutch translates to dike or depart. Dike meaning you build dikes, like you give your time to building up the dikes to keep the sea from rolling in at high tide or during floods, or get out of the country. And I can see people basically saying, okay, you have to be here as part of a group protecting the town, or we don't want you here in the town. I just see America going towards that, because ultimately people will do anything to protect the safety of their families. And a lot of people are moving, but I mean, not everybody finds New Zealand interesting enough to move to, and New Zealand's not going to be able to take everybody who wants to move there. A lot of the places that look like safe havens are going to be way oversubscribed in terms of people living there. One country that's been very popular with wealthy expatriates is Switzerland. And I have a number of friends who are going to Zug, Z-U-G, which is just north of Zurich, and because there's a crypto valley there. So they're going to be around in a different country, but they're not going to be lonely because they have people who are working on a common purpose. So ultimately, governments have strengths and weaknesses, and one weakness is that they are very easy to be overawed by violent mobs and arsonists. But one of their strengths is that they can create regulation to attract birds of a feather who are really good at industries of the future. I would just say, since we're closing in on our time, that one of the most amazing things for me that's a lost opportunity from the Trump administration, because Trump was going to be the billionaire and the businessman and run the country on business principles. One of the things he completely missed was that there's $100 trillion opportunity, and that is in the transition from a world that's 80% fueled by fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, and oil, to a world that is 100% fueled by the sun and the wind and by gravity and the waves. So the moon is basically in this tidal lock with the earth, and all those waves, that moon energy, that gravity energy, that is plenty of energy for coastal cities, which is where most people live. The sun gives us 6,000 times the energy that we consume from all sources. So we only have to capture a tiny fraction of it. The wind is very useful, and so on. And we can put these things on our homes. All homes should be solar. All cars should be electric. This is a huge opportunity. And I don't know why we would want to give China $100 trillion, because some portion of that, let's say 30% of it, is going to be profit. And they're going to put a certain percentage of all their profits, all their taxes, into the military, and they're going to deploy it. Right now, they're having border disputes with 23 nations. So it's not enough to just shrug off whole industry sectors. We look at, for instance, the two biggest job-creating sectors that happened when Trump was sworn in. Number one was solar. So a solar job can be created for $50,000. Do you know what it costs to create a job in oil, it costs about $5 to $10 million. So if you have limited capital, if you're not dealing with this fantasy money, monopoly money, and you want to create jobs, you want to create as many jobs as possible in something where the job creation is very, very inexpensive. And the other thing was in cannabis. And CBD is very useful for reducing inflammation. And inflammation is at the core of most of our current health problems. So why would we not want to put money into areas that are creating jobs, which will put money in America rather than in China, and things that will improve human health? So we could have had a lot more jobs. And you say, well, why do we need jobs? Well, at the beginning, you talked about COVID. 400 million jobs were lost. So there are about 8 billion people in the world today. About 5 to 6 billion people are of working age and are not handicapped and could work. At least 3 to 4 billion people want jobs. And at the beginning of COVID, only about 1.2 billion people had jobs and 400 million of them. So we went from 1.2 billion people employed to 800 million people employed, about a third of all of those people with jobs. So now we have a world with 8 billion people and only 800 million people with jobs. So only 1 in 10 people on our planet has a job. We need to get as serious as a heart attack. We need to be ridiculously serious about creating jobs everywhere. And the thing about oil and creating oil is that it's not enough just for the United States to prosper. We have to help other people. And only 55 nations out of 215 have any oil. So you've got all these, basically over 150 nations, 160 nations that don't have oil. And yet, you know what they all have? They all have air, they all have water, and they all have sunshine. And we can make ammonia, NH3, from air, water, and sunshine. Basically, you have air, you have water, and you have solar for the electricity, boom. And we can take all the existing cars, trucks, buses that are not electric, and we can either convert them to being electric, which is really expensive, or we can convert them to burning ammonia. And the byproduct, if you burn ammonia, is, ta-da, air and water. So you turn air and water into a fuel that works in cars, trucks, buses, boats, aircraft, tanks, everything, and then converts back into air and water as the exhaust. This is a world that the United States government looked at because at one point, we were so terrified of the Soviet Union and of China that back in the 50s, that the military asked, what are we going to do if we're cut off from fossil fuels? And the answer was, well, we'll go to ammonia. And then the Air Force said, but can you run planes and rockets on ammonia? And so they made the X-15. The X-15 ran on ammonia, went 7 times the speed of sound, and those turbines in that plane became the turbines that allowed us to take natural gas. So all this natural gas, the shift in the utilities from burning coal and oil and then more and more to natural gas, that was from that project. So the US government has put quite a lot of money into looking at this. It's a viable thing. So you would ask me before this started, like, what if somebody is a billionaire, where should they put their money? That's such an easy question to answer. I would put it into 3 things. Number 1, into the transition from a world that's 80% fossil fuels to a world that is clean energy. Because all these people who are burning down Santa Monica, these arsonists, it's only a matter of time before they come after refineries and they come after oil pipelines. And there's no way to protect tens of thousands of miles of oil pipeline. What are you going to do? Put armed drones every 50 yards along hundreds of thousands of miles? It's not protectable. The thing about solar is you put it on your building, your house, your office, whatever, hooked up to your electric car. You can't just take it all out. You can't take out the grid with one terrorist attack. It's more defensible. It's more secure. The second thing that I would do is I would look at the fact that Google has effectively become the biggest intelligence agency. And so what Google does is it says, hey, phone company, you can take this Android operating system for free, but you have to include Google Maps. You have to include Gboard keyboards. You have to include all these different things. And if you don't include this, we're going to charge you money for it. But if you do include it, it's free. And then they get anywhere from $35 to $350 a year from taking all that data, putting it in the cloud, putting it in their ad servers, including the DoubleClick ad servers that in order to acquire a DoubleClick, they absolutely swore up and down to the US government they would not do, and they're basically doing it. So the next big area is people paying for privacy and security equivalents. The third thing is that people think governments are liars, and governments are behind government debt and government currencies. So all of the currencies are going to be replaced by cryptocurrencies, and government debt is going to have a crypto equivalent. And also, all these people who are doing things, we're talking about the
Alex, you're breaking up a little bit as people want to hear your 3 points for billionaires.
Oh, sure. So
Okay. There you go.
The last thing is, so basically making new kinds of cryptocurrency, crypto commodities, crypto derivatives, because ultimately your security is not dependent upon a regulatory agency, but it's dependent upon math. So if you look at Bitcoin, Bitcoin is very interesting for two reasons. Number one, it was the best performing investment of the last decade and possibly the last 100 years, depending on how you measure it, depending on when you got in. At the early stage, Bitcoin was 1,300 to the dollar, and now it's over $10,000. So at above $8,000, that's 100 million% return. The second thing is, without any government agency trying to protect it, it's never been successfully hacked. So you had a couple things where for 45 minutes, people got control of some, there's never been any control that is allowed for putting out fake Bitcoins for more than 45 minutes. And so you have in a world where every government agency has been hacked, every corporation's been hacked, you have something that's not been hacked where all of the code is available. You can download all the code, you can look at it all, and anybody can look, any 12-year-old with a laptop can look at the entire blockchain at every transaction. So this combination of great return and better security and better transparency is going to be appealing to in a world where governments lie and get away with it. I personally think that anybody in government who lies should have to resign at whatever level. And you don't have to speak, say, sorry, I'm not going to answer that question. You can do that. Nobody's saying you have to speak, but to be able to lie and lie and lie and lie, we can't keep doing that. So basically these three areas, the transition to clean energy, the transition to privacy and security, and this transition to crypto everything, those are the three big areas that I would put money into.
I think the first and third are relatively obvious, but when you were talking about Google and the second one in privacy and security, do you mean investing in cybersecurity technologies? What do you mean?
No, I mean there needs to be search, like there are alternative search engines to Google and there are alternatives to Facebook, but they're not well funded. I think that somebody, just like rich people found Mark Zuckerberg and made him go from an obnoxious Harvard student who was rating girls to somebody who was well funded. You know, basically these other alternatives need their Peter Thiel mentors, Medici. There's the need for more Medicis who will find their Leonardos of privacy and security.
Oh, well, you're going to get me started now. Okay, I'm going to run an idea by you that I've been talking a little bit about, and it's one of the consulting projects I'm on now with a very big family. Basically, the idea is we're going to invest 80%, let's call it diversified, global, and conservative, but the other 20%, including some of the things you discussed, but one thing that they're effectively doing is creating their own internal VC. They're hiring some professionals, they're engaging the next generation of the family, and let's just assume if they were to make 1,000 investments at 50 to 100,000, you know, again, they're a multi-billion-dollar family. That's 50 to 100 million in 1,000 companies. I think just by the randomness, 5 or 10 of those are going to probably explode and take off, that they could double down. They could get early insight. Do you think that significant families should do a similar approach to that, or that's too much?
Well, I would say that that's not enough, because you could invest in 1,000 things and they could all fail. But what you want to have is something that makes the world a better place. Because one thing that I like about family offices is that typically they're thinking about the next generation and the next generation. They have a longer term time perspective, and that's very useful. There are two things that are basically they're other forms of IQ. One is a very fast reaction time. So a typical human reaction time is 600 milliseconds, basically 0.6 of a second. But if you can get that down to below 200 milliseconds, it's as if you have a big jump in IQ. You're just able to do things faster. And it is possible to speed up the time it takes you to understand something. And the second thing is a long-term time perspective. So typically when they have somebody who's got a long-term time perspective, and if you think about how to live longer, like I'd like to live to 123. Peter Diamandis says he wants to live to 700. If you have this long-term time perspective, it changes what you invest in. And so ultimately you want two things. One is you want something that is not going to destroy the productive base of capital. So the global economy from last year was about 82 trillion. That was GDP. Angelo, do you know what the value of all of the free goods and services from nature is? The mangroves cleaning the water and the bees pollinating the flowers. If you put a dollar value on that, you know what that's worth?
No.
$80 trillion. So what we should do is we should have every country make a measure of its free services from nature and its GDP and add that. And that should be the aggregated gross national product or something, because China once did a green GDP. And what they did is they said, okay, here's the environmental destruction, and here's how it reduced the value of this water or this land or these trees. And then they put their GDP on top of it. And what they found was that they had negative GDP if they looked at the destruction of their natural resources. So China, the bigger it gets, the worse it is, the less livable it is. Bad water, bad air, everything. So ultimately, you have to have a blue economy investment. Now, let's just say that you put all those investments in, and it's part of a similar philosophy. You're making things out of recycling. You're making clean energy. If people at one company who have drank the Kool-Aid and who have a similar philosophy in line with the family office, that starts to fail and they leave, those people can be redeployed in a company that has similar values but a better business model. So the idea is that you create your own equivalent of a mini city. So what I would do if I were a family office is I would have these companies all be in the same city, and preferably where the family office is, where they can have world-class speakers come. And if you're a part of the portfolio of that company, you get to hear a world-class speaker every week. That's part of the deal. That's part of the package. Because if you're young, you value advice from world-class people. So for instance, you make a deal so that Elon Musk comes by once a year or something like that. You want to have big, prestigious, successful people who will come and can be asked questions. The other
Alex,
thing that I would say, oh, sure.
Two questions for you, but I did
Sure.
get a text that someone is intrigued by what you're talking about. They're likely going to have to run. We were going to save it to the end, but why don't now, for those that would like to learn more about your Lightman report and perhaps ways to contact you, how you consult or engage with families in crypto, blockchain, technology, and some of the things we're talking about, how can people learn more about you?
Sure. The easiest way to do it is through Alex Lightman, Policy Advisor and Futurist. It's a public page on Facebook. That's the easiest way to do it.
And repeat that again, please.
Sure. Facebook, Alex Lightman, Policy Advisor and Futurist is the name of my public page.
Got it. And I'm someone who does follow Alex since I met him a couple of years ago on Facebook. I love his stuff. And again, he has lots of opinions and lots of facts behind it as well. But I really enjoy whether, again, sometimes I agree or not. Like all of us, there's going to be disagreements. My two questions, and this also reminds me of my Monday meeting is going to cover this, as we have someone in Europe and Switzerland, and we cover dual citizenship, offshore banks, trust, so many different topics offshore. But I am starting to hear more and more about Estonia. Given your experience in crypto and blockchain, I think they have some interesting regulation there. I don't quite know if it's an EU country yet, like Montenegro is trying to be and probably will get accepted. Relative to your crypto experiences, any perspective on Estonia?
Sure. Estonia is very forward thinking. It's a little cold. It's just below Finland. They speak a language that's like Finnish, but they have e-residency. So
Yes.
Steve Jurvetson, who was formerly on the board of Tesla and SpaceX, has been a big advocate of e-residency. And so that makes sense. Everybody should have a plan B country in their back pocket, because we're going to start to see takings. Basically, just people, rich people are going to get a knock on the door, and people are going to show up, and they're going to just, there's going to be some excuse to take their wealth because there's too many deficits. And this is what happens when you have bad fiscal policy at governments. You know, the Weimar Republic inflation is what led to the rise of Hitler. And Hitler said, shit, where do I get money? Oh, the Jews have the money. How about if we kill them and we just take their gold and their assets? And if they want to leave, well, they can leave, but they can't take any of their money with them. So you see more and more places in the United States. Did you know that California is trying to make taxes 10 years retroactive?
Wow.
So this idea that the country will just make taxes retroactive, or take a wealth tax and make it retroactive. Every rich person who doesn't want to see the United States become this giant place that doesn't respect private property. And ultimately, you know, those places that respect private property do much better than those that don't. Just look at Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe took the land from the white farmers, and Robert Mugabe got standing ovations at the United Nations, even as he was getting the blood of teenagers so that he could look pretty good in his 90s. That kind of parasymbiosis actually works, unfortunately, so that will create a big vampire class. But now Zimbabwe is begging the farmers to come back because they were the breadbasket of Africa, and now they're a basket case. You cannot take a system, an ecosystem of people who are experts that know the soil, the water, the land, the weather, how to make it all work, and then just replace it by people who just want to have what rich people have. It's much better for rich people to leave and then pen scathing op-eds as on their way out the door than pretty much anything else I can think of. I think rich people should leave overtaxed states. I think they should leave overtaxed countries and places that don't respect private property, but just become perpetual travelers. The best old book on this topic is by James Dale Davidson and Lord Rees-Mogg. It's called The Sovereign Individual. And in this book, it basically says, if you have money or you want to have money in the future, you better have multiple countries in your back pocket, because countries are going to go crazy and seize your wealth. And right now, the drum beats of propaganda are set up so that they're going to have this kind of mob approach to taking wealth.
Yeah, I mean, you know, my audience has heard me talk about that, especially since COVID, and a lot of my creative work and consulting over the summer, and the work that I do with my largest multi-billion-dollar families. You know, I'm as American as anyone, and I think we'll figure it out. But it's good to have a plan B and a plan C from offshore entities and trust, which will give you greater protection. I won't get too deep into fraudulent conveyance, which is the problem with certain revocable trust here in the US. They could look back 7 or 10 years, but having and owning, and there's great reasons to, private banks, specifically offshore, insurance and reinsurance companies, I'm going to argue your own VC company, are all things that I'm seeing multi-billionaire families do. I know because they reach out to me and some of my network and connections to kind of help make some of that happen. I told you offline a couple of years ago, one of my families that skew to a certain political party got a knock on the door, just like what you said, basically from a government official, an FBI agent, and an IRS agent, and they took their passports right there. And they were able to get some civil forfeiture against the family. The family did fight back. They had some money and resources, and it was a negotiated settlement, so a little bit of a compromise. but it does not have to be Venezuela. The government confiscates your money through taxation. At the stroke of a political pen, your taxes could go up. That's very likely to happen by the 20th of next January. We'll see. And federal and every state has civil forfeiture. They could take your stuff.
Well, look at, the main opposition to legalization of cannabis is from police forces that love just saying, oh, look, there's cannabis in your car. We're taking your car and now we're going to auction it off and keep the money. I mean, we have a society that is riddled like termites with perverse incentives to attack citizens and take their private property to fill someone's budget deficit. So the police chief in Santa Monica, in a city where I haven't seen a police officer on the street. Okay, they have cars that drive by with sirens, all the time. But I mean, actually seeing a police officer in the street, I haven't seen that since May. And we have many police officers in the city who make $300,000, $400,000 a year. What are they doing? So that's a city. And now all of the retail establishments have been crushed with a few restaurants open, but probably 90% of the downtown retail is still closed. People aren't coming. The tourists aren't coming. It's seen as a dangerous area. So they're going to want to not only raise taxes, but they're going to want to find some excuse to steal people's property.
And Alex, I'm going to have to run in 2 more minutes. My final question, it's worthy of a podcast in and of itself. And I have a son who's graduating high school next summer, but plenty of people have children, grandchildren that are high school age, that are college age, and they're going to be going out to the entrepreneur or workforce coming very, very shortly. What would you recommend? And yes, I could say follow their passion and be happy. That's all great, but they need to support themselves financially. Unless one day we have universal base income, we'll save that discussion for a different time. But how may you recommend for someone to create wealth if they're young?
To become to become the world expert or to invent a new field. So for those people who don't have a job, write a book. Ebooks now are being sold on Amazon that are 60 pages. A friend of mine just did one, The Road Ahead on COVID, for 150 pages. Write a book on something that you're really knowledgeable about. And you remember that phrase from Zig Ziglar, that you can get whatever you want as long as you help enough other people get what they want. So look at what other people want, write a book that tells them how to get it, and then dwell and swim like a fish in that pond. Because once you write a book, the great thing that comes from writing a book is that smart people in that area will call and say, oh, but you left this out. And then you get all this free coaching and free mentoring from all these people that makes you an even better expert. And we remember who is first, like who was the first person to fly from, the US to Europe? It was Lindbergh. Okay, who was number 2? Nobody knows. Who was the first woman? Well, Amelia Earhart. Who was number 2? Nobody knows. People know who the expert is in the field. And the thing that young people have right now is they have the ability to see what old people or older people are missing. Where are the gaps? Why is the world in such dire straits? What did we miss? Tell us, and then become an expert in that and tell us not just the problem, but the solution. That's what you should do. Even if it's not the most interesting thing in the world, because accounting isn't the most interesting thing, but it's really important. You need to have good, clear books. So don't just do what your passion is, because you don't know what the world is all about at that age. You have a very, very distorted, maybe a 100th of 1% keyhole view of what's out in the world, but find a really big problem that affects people. How can people live longer? How can they be smarter? How can they maintain their wealth? How can we reduce perverse incentives, let's say in insurance? How do we stop the problem of people getting fire insurance and setting their buildings on fire? How do we basically get rid of that? That's what people should do. They should write a book or make a video and be known for that.
Stealing some of my secrets, Alex. I guess I'm glad I'm practicing some of those principles. I wish I had more time. There's so much to unpack and to follow up to what Alex said, but we're over an hour already. Unfortunately, that will have to wait to a part 2. Everyone, I'm Angelo Robles. I'm the host of the Angelo Robles podcast and founder and CEO at Family Office Association, a global membership organization dedicated to successful families and their family offices. We provide a significant amount of research, thought leadership, consultative services, host programming. It's all Zoom now, but we're incredibly active and air daily. So we've been very active during COVID-19. I'm active on social media. We're Family Office on YouTube. Go and subscribe and check out my new website, FamilyOfficeAssociation.com. And my email is angelo@FamilyOfficeAssociation.com. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alex. It was a great guest. Look forward to next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelo.